All right, let's get started. My name is Sari, and I'm the coordinator for the National Human Trafficking and Disabilities Working Group, who will be presenting this webinar for you today. And we are a volunteer-run collaboration consisting of professionals, self-advocates, and survivors from both human trafficking and disability communities from all over the United States. And we work to create resources and address gaps in research, social services, and legal services for individuals with disabilities who may be at risk of being trafficked or who may have experienced human trafficking. Our mission is to promote a survivor-centered, collaborative approach steeped in disability and racial justice for the prevention of trafficking of individuals with disabilities and deaf individuals. And our values include racial and disability justice, survivor-centered approach, collaboration, and advocacy for action. Today, we have presenting for you our wonderful steering committee member, Sandra Harrell, who is the Associate Director of Vera Institute of Justice's Center on Victimization. And without further ado, I'm going to let Sandra introduce herself. Thank you so much for all of you for being here.
Thank you so much, Sari, and thank you for those of you who have set aside some time today to learn about how to make your trainings and events more accessible to people with disabilities. My name is Sandra Harrell. I am a white woman with dirty blonde hair, and I'm wearing glasses and a horizontal striped shirt. And behind me is a gray wall and an open door. I have been with the Vera Institute of Justice for the last 15 years and been working at the intersection of disability and victimization for the last 17 years. When I first started doing this work 17 years ago, prior to that, I'd been working in the survivor advocacy field for 14 years. And what really made me proud to be in that movement was the commitment to being inclusive of and to being able to serve every survivor that came through our door. And we all know we've fallen short in lots of ways, including being able to provide adequate services, appropriate services for survivors of color and immigrant survivors. We definitely have fallen short in a lot of ways. But one of the things that I think our movement has still not done a great job of is addressing the needs of survivors with disabilities. And this shows up in the ways that we provide trainings, that when we schedule our events, all of these things have barriers for people with disabilities to be able to participate that really send a very clear signal to people with disabilities that they are not welcome. And I don't think that is your intent. I don't think that is the intent of our movement, but it happens. And so we began developing at Vera some really concrete strategies for how you can account for the needs of people with disabilities at your trainings and events. And that will allow you to make sure that people with disabilities can participate. And then you have the opportunity to really learn from people with disabilities as part of them being a part of your trainings and events. So why is it important that you are accounting for people with disabilities? If we're using the Americans with Disability Act's a definition of disability, at least 1 in 5 people living in the United States has at least one disability. And If you are using the World Health Organization's definition, that jumps up to 1 in 4 people has at least one disability. So it's hard to imagine that in our work around human trafficking, that we are not seeing survivors of human trafficking who have disabilities, that we don't need to pay attention to the needs of people with disabilities in our work to end human trafficking and to ensure that services are available for human trafficking survivors. So it's really critical that you are designing every element of your events from soup to nuts, that to really account for the needs of people with disabilities. And when we think about designing events, we really think about the different environments that we all as human beings have to navigate as we move through the world. So there's often the communication environment that we're having to navigate. There's the technology environment that we're having to navigate. There's the physical environment, obviously, that we have to navigate. And then, of course, there's an attitudinal environment. And though each of those environments really show up in a variety of ways at your events. So I'm going to talk about how through every element of every stage of your events, you can really take into account ways to be more inclusive of people with disabilities. I also want to take just a second to say that we are primarily using the Q&A box for questions and answers during this session. So as I'm talking, if you have a question, please put it into the Q&A box. My colleague Jody is going to be monitoring the Q&A box. So when a question comes up that is really relevant to something that I've just said, she's going to interrupt me and say, hey, there's a question here, and I can respond in the moment. And then, of course, if you have a question that's not relevant to something that I've just said, but it's just a burning question, you can put it in the Q&A box and we'll get to it either at the end or at a natural pause. Just wanted to say that. So when you think about the attitudinal environment, the communication environment, the physical environment, and the technological environment that we're all having to navigate, one of the key elements of event planning that really comes into play is registration. With registration, you are collecting information that, well, first of all, with your registration, just the questions that you ask will create an attitudinal environment that is either welcoming of people with disabilities or not. And then with the questions that you ask, you're able to then create accessible physical environments, communication environments, and physical or technological environments. So let's start with this. With registration, if you're planning to provide accommodations only by request, you have to do registration in advance. This is because as you're asking questions about accommodations, if you don't ask, if you're not going to ask questions about accommodations, that means that you have to proactively provide accommodations and be prepared to provide accommodations to the entire universe of requests that may come in. If you do registration, you're able to collect information and only provide accommodations that come in, which for lots of organizations who have tighter budgets, that works a lot better. How far in advance depends on your existing relationships and your resources. So if you don't have any relationships with disability organizations, or you don't have existing relationships with ASL interpreting agencies, you may need to open registration really far in advance of your event and then close it 2 months out so that you're prepared to make those, build those relationships and then to find the accommodations that have been asked for. Another key thing is that you close registration in advance for those requesting accommodation. You have to close registration for everyone. Just think about this. as an equity issue. You can't say to people with disabilities that they have to register by X time, but everyone else has up until the event to register. So if you're closing registration in advance in order to address the accommodation request, you need to close registration for everyone, and you kind of have to be inflexible about that. If you have proactively built out your event to be really, really accessible already, you might be able to keep registration open longer, because that means that some requests that come in, you've already created the bandwidth for yourself to be able to respond to those, right? But you really need to be thoughtful with your planning team about when you should close registration, whether or not you have the existing relationships to close registration 2 weeks out from your event, or if you want to give yourself 2 months. And with the registration process, you really want to designate somebody who is responsible for checking the accommodation requests on a regular basis, because as those requests come in, another way that you can really address your attitudinal environment so that it's more welcoming to people with disabilities is that as a request comes in, you reach out to the person who made the request, confirm that that request has been received and that you're providing the accommodation that they requested. Or in some cases, you may need to say, hey, we received this request. We're just checking in to see if this would be appropriate as an alternative to what you've requested. And if not, we'll work to achieve the request that you've put in here. That you don't have the knowledge or ability to be able to provide them with that, but you're able to do something as an alternative. I'll give you a for instance. So a lot of people with intellectual disabilities may request that you hire someone to do note taking throughout the event for them. And you may say, would it be okay if we got you a C-print, someone who could do C-print interpretation instead, and explain that a C-print basically is CART interpreting, but that it is put into more simplified language. So that might be a request that is easier for you to achieve than finding someone who has the skill set to take notes in plain or simple language, on your team. And then, of course, if you're designating someone who's responsible for checking the accommodation requests on a regular basis, you also want to make sure that you're designating someone who is responsible for ensuring those requests are met. This may or may not be the same person who is responsible for checking the request, because the person who is responsible for ensuring the requests are met really needs to have high knowledge around the range of accommodations that might come through. They have to have some soft skills around talking to people, for instance, negotiating alternatives to the request that came in. And then if you want to also, as I mentioned, reach out to those requesting those accommodations to confirm and ensure that you're meeting the needs. And so that person, again, needs to have good communication skills, be diplomatic, make sure that they're using, people first language that's going to resonate with the person that they're communicating with. So again, it may or may not be the person who is responsible for checking the accommodation requests. We recommend, and this is, we're dreaming of a time post-COVID when we're actually doing in-person events again. But if you're hosting an event where lodging is going to be required, we do recommend that even if you're not paying for the participant lodging, that you inquire about their lodging needs, including whether they need an ADA room with a roll-in shower, an ADA room with tub and chair, a room accessible for deaf, hard of hearing, chemical-free room, or other. And then you can ask them to please specify. And the reason we recommend this is that hotels have a tendency to really not know the types of rooms that they're booking people into. They know it's an ADA room, but they don't know whether it's a roll-in shower room or a tub and chair room. So what we do when we host an event is the day before our event, we go through our registration. We look at the people who have requested different types of rooms, and then we ask the hotel to show us the room that they've booked them into, because they may need to change that reservation and move that person into the right kind of room. Because somebody who's requested an ADA room with a roll-in shower is not going to be able to make an ADA room with a tub and chair work, and vice versa could also be true. I have a colleague who needs to have a tub and chair in order to be able to shower. A roll-in shower room just doesn't work for her. So you just have to go through and check on all of that. And as a quick note about deaf, hard of hearing rooms, you can actually retrofit a standard room with what is called a deaf kit at a hotel. And so and a lot of times that if you have a limited number of ADA rooms, but you have a large number of deaf, hard of hearing folks coming to your event, which fingers crossed that will be the case at some point, you may want to retrofit those standard rooms with the deaf kit. And because deaf folks, unless they have another disability as well, don't need the features that are in ADA rooms. So that's just a little bit about some of what the questions that you may want to ask about lodging. It's also great to ask very specific questions in your registration to signal to people that you're really prepared to meet their accommodation needs. So a range of questions that we ask in our registration is whether they will need electronic copies of materials in advance, electronic text file of materials on site, hard copies of materials on site, materials in Braille, materials in font over 14 point. We're going to talk a little bit more about fonts, size, and type later on. But we recommend that the standard for the most universally, the more universally accessible size font is 14 points. So ideally, all of your materials will be 14-point fonts. And so you want to ask whether they want materials in a font that is over that. And then, of course, it's also helpful to ask whether or not somebody will need wheelchair access, not because you're only going to create one space for wheelchair accessibility. It's just a signal to folks like, okay, they're thinking about me. They're at least thinking about people who use wheelchairs, the people who are planning this event. So we'll talk more about setting up your physical space, but I don't want you to take away that you can just create one spot for wheelchair access at your event. But this is just a question that you ask that is a signal to people that you're thinking about them. You're also going to want to ask about interpreting needs. So again, the more specific that you are in your registration, the more you're signaling to people that that you are able to meet their needs. And not only that, but it gives them, it gets you a lot of really good information about the specific interpreting needs that folks have. Someone might say that they need an American Sign Language interpreter, but they may actually need a close vision sign language interpreter. And that means that you're going to need more than two sets of interpreters. If somebody uses signed English, that's different than American Sign Language. So you need to know that information. And somebody requests a certified deaf interpreter. Again, that just means that you have to have both the certified deaf interpreter plus an American Sign Language interpreting team to follow that person around. So the more that you ask these very specific questions, the better prepared you are to meet the needs of the people who attend your event. And again, it's really critical that you're following up with people who make these requests to ensure that you are hiring the interpreters who are going to be the best fit for that individual. Most of us are doing registration on electronic platforms now. And if that's the case, it's really important that you make registration available in alternate formats as well, such as a paper version, something that people can print out. Or make it possible for people to be able to register by phone. There's a variety of reasons for that. It could be that folks are living in a place where they don't have access to the internet. And so they just need someone else to be able to print that out for them so they can fill it out and send it back to you. It could be, and this has been the case for us, that people have low, like reading is not their forte. And so they call us up and we help them register by phone so that they're not depending just on reading to be able to participate in our events. We always offer to assist people with registration and all of our materials. If you need any help, this is who you can contact. And of course, if you're using an online registration platform, you want to make sure that it's accessible to individuals who are blind or low vision, and that they're able to use a screen reader to access your registration form. And there's lots of guidelines for making sure that something is accessible to a screen reader, but the big thing is just that there's a proper reading order, that that they're able to tab through the platform to get to different places, and that just follows a logical order and makes sense to a screen reader. You also want to make sure that any platform that you're using is compliant with the Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act and 21st Century and Video Accessibility Act, not because it's legal requirement, but because those set the foundation, the baseline for accessibility. And so if your platform is not compliant with those pieces, it's not going to be accessible. Those establish the floor for accessibility. So you definitely want to look at the platform and make sure that they have a note that they are compliant with Section 508 of the Rehab Act and the 24th Century Video Accessibility Act. And then you can always check the accessibility of an online survey or a platform that you're using by using a free web accessibility tool such as Wave. That's just www.wave.webaim.org. That will give you a good sense of whether something has no compliance, 1A compliance, AA compliance, or AAA compliance. You're really going for AAA compliance, but AA compliance can work in some situations. So let's just take a moment here to pause and reflect about the platforms that you've used or that you've registered through before. Do you feel like they were accessible? And if not, what steps do you think could have been taken to make them more accessible or to enhance the accessibility of the registration process? And also think about whether or not you saw questions about accessibility in your registration process. And you can type some stuff into the chat if you'd like, as you're thinking about that. This is also something that you can take back to your organization or to the people who are planning events that you attend, to just say, hey, let's think about our registration platform and whether or not it's accessible. So in order to achieve accessibility, you do have to be planful and proactive. I tell everyone that you cannot plan for accessibility on the fly. You can't decide to make something accessible on Wednesday when your event is Thursday. You have to be very, very planful about it. And part of that is because there are things that cost money. And if you don't have it in your budget to pay for, then you're not going to be able to provide that accommodation. So I want to talk you through some of the accommodations and access requests that do have a monetary symbol attached to it. American Sign Language interpreters, putting materials in large font. This doesn't have a giant budgetary implication, but it does mean that there's going to be more pages for materials. So your printing budget might go up a little bit. The number of pages will go up a bit. So that's just something to keep in mind. Materials in Braille. This requires both time and money because you need to find the right Braille house to be printing those materials, and you definitely need to be able to provide more of those materials far in advance to make sure that you get them in time for your event. And then, of course, there's a cost associated with getting them printed in Braille. Providing electronic materials in advance has, again, a smaller cost associated with it. It's generally staff time that we're talking about when we're thinking about electronic materials in advance, because it's just a staff person making sure that all of your materials are in a place where they can be accessed electronically. Again, hard copies of materials on site. This has a printing implication. Again, if you were planning on providing all of your materials via a USB drive, but somebody requests hard copies of materials on site, you get an additional a line item there that you need to plan for. CART and C-print. So the difference between CART and C-print, I kind of touched upon this earlier, but CART is real-time captioning. And so there's basically a screen and then a CART person who will type in exactly what the presenter is saying, and it'll go up on the screen. Whereas C-print is a little bit different in that it's more individualized to folks, and the person is actually interpreting what the person is saying into plainer, simpler language that is more easily accessible for people with intellectual disabilities. Assistive listening devices, these are not necessarily access requests, but they do have access implications, because if somebody is using an assistive listening device, those devices often work over the frequency of microphones. And so you have to be using microphones at your event, no matter how big your event is, no matter how much you can project your voice. It's necessary to be using microphones if folks have assistive listening devices. And we should just assume that we have people in our audiences who are getting information through assistive listening devices. There's a large number of people who are hard of hearing, who have single-sided deafness. This is happening to people 50 years old and up, people even younger than that. So don't assume that, and I wouldn't ask questions about assistive listening devices. I just plan that there's going to be somebody in my audience who is accessing the sound through an assistive listening device, and therefore plan to have microphones and all of that stuff. And then, of course, there's additional audiovisual services that we'll talk about in just a moment that have some costs related to them. So let's talk about money. Let's talk about figures here. So for virtual events, some of the common access line items that you were really looking for is accessible platform. everything starts and ends with your platform when you're hosting virtual events. And if your platform is not accessible, it's sort of like if your front door to your building is too narrow and is only accessible by a flight of stairs. If you have chosen an inaccessible platform, nothing that you're going to do is going to really create an accessible experience for folks. So you really, that's where you want to start, is making sure you're choosing an accessible platform. And those can start at $1,200 per year and can go up to as much as $5,000 a year and even higher than that. We are using Zoom Webinar. Zoom Webinar is I would not say the Cadillac version of accessibility when it comes to platforms, because it has a number of little glitches. The live captioning that they provide is AI captioning, and there's lots of mistakes that get made, and it's kind of hard to follow because it's producing the captioning as I'm talking, and so it might edit out as I correct a word. And also there's a couple of other things with Zoom Webinar, but they are not such outstanding issues that we weren't able to continue to use Zoom Webinar. And we chose to use Zoom Webinar over what we consider like sort of more the Cadillac version, Adobe Connect, because it's easier to use. And so sometimes you have to make some rationale, like actually have to think through, okay, sure, this one platform has every bell and whistle that we could possibly imagine, but it's hard to find all those bells and whistles, and it's really hard for people to figure out how to use it. And especially for us, because we work with a lot of people with intellectual disabilities, we want to make sure that it's as user-friendly as possible. And because we work with a lot of folks in the deaf community, the video on Zoom Webinar is just far better than Adobe Connect. And so we opted for Zoom Webinar because of those things. But we did have Adobe Connect for a while, and it did cost us $5,000 a year. So it can go higher than that, depending on sort of the subscription that you get and how many people you want attending. But that's about what we've seen. And then, of course, ASL interpreters for virtual events. I think if you are opening up an event to the public and you have no idea who is going to be coming, and you're not doing registration, you want to plan always to have ASL interpreters and live captioning. For ASL interpreters, you're thinking about for anything over an hour, you're planning for a 2-person team, and $65 to $75 an hour per interpreter. So let's say for a 2-hour event that you're doing, you're thinking $260, because 65 times 2 would be $260. So that's about what you want to plan for. And then live captioning can range from $75 to $90 an hour. Live captioning is different than the AI captioning that is going on in our current webinar. It is it's an actual person who is trained in captioning, who is typing out the words as I speak. And it's better than AI captioning. It's about a 95% accuracy rate for live captioning. So if you're doing an event and you want to have sort of the highest level of accessibility, I would go with live captioning. However, this does have a major budgetary implication for you, because in Zoom, the live captioning doesn't convey into the recording. So you have to then do post-production captioning. So you're paying twice, and that's about $2 per minute. And then, of course, particularly in the trafficking field, we need to be thinking about spoken language interpreters as well. And so spoken language interpreters can also range from $65 to $75 per hour. It can be way more than that, depending on the language requested. We've had requests for spoken language interpreters in like Russian, and we like that was far more expensive than spoken language interpreters in Spanish. Checking, are there any questions? Are y'all still with me? All right, so for in-person events, we're looking at some of the similar stuff. So $65 to $75 an hour for your ASL interpreters and spoken language interpreters. But then you also have the audio visual costs. So for audio visual, we're really thinking about the stage, the LCD projectors, the microphones, and all of that is really going to be depending on your venue. So I never put actual prices in here for audio visual because it changes so much. But if you do have CART and C-print, you want to make sure that you're budgeting about a little over $500 because you're going to have $65 to $75 an hour for the CART interpreter. They also work in two-person teams. And then if you're going to be putting the CART at the front of the room on a screen, you have to pay for the screen. And then if you're going to be doing it, and then you also have to pay for internet. You can also do CART interpreting so that it's individualized, so it's sitting in front of the person. That's one of those pieces of the conversation that when somebody requests CART, you want to follow up with that person to say, hey, we can do it this way or we can do it this way. What do you prefer? I would only do that though if there was only like one or two people who requested CART. If you've had lots of requests for CARTs at your in-person event, I would just plan on having CART in every breakout room or every plenary session, and have it at the front of the room because that's just gonna be far more cost efficient for you. We actually, because we got so many requests from people along the way around assistive listening devices, we actually invested in this. It goes into our meeting planning toolkit, and they range from $100 to $300. So we've had people who've come up to us at an event and it's just like, I'm really struggling to hear, and we are able to say, hey, we have this assistive listening device, and they use it and they love it and they're super excited and they go out and purchase their own. So we have found it useful, but of course, our audience is primarily people with disabilities and deaf people. And so that may not be an investment that you want to make. If you have presenters who are people with disabilities at your events and they're having to travel in, they may end up having to travel with a personal care attendant. If that's the case, you want to budget for their personal care attendants, airfare, lodging, and per diem, as well as theirs. That's the cost associated with bringing in somebody who may have a personal care attendant. The other thing that changes in your in-person events is the room rental. So I think I talk about this a little bit later, but I'm going to talk about it now too. But when you are thinking about setting up an accessible meeting space, you're looking at like your venues, like meeting room capacity chart, they have created that capacity chart, assuming that they could stuff as many people into that room as possible without violating the fire codes. That is not accessible. When you are trying to create an accessible event, you are, and especially in the time of COVID, you want to create lots of space in that event. So prior to COVID, we were recommending that you create 36-inch aisleways between all barriers. That's 36-inch aisleways between the tables at the back of the room and the wall, 36-inch aisleways between the tables on the sides of the room and the wall, 36-inch aisleways between the LCD cart, this 36-inch aisleways between all barriers. I'm going to pause for the interpreter switch. And so what that means is you are probably, if you have a 300-person event, that the hotel says, okay, we can get your 300 people into 6 breakout rooms, having 50 people in each of those breakout rooms, it's more likely that you can accessibly get about 30 people into each of those breakout rooms, which means what? You need to have more breakout rooms. And if you need more breakout rooms, you might need more presenters. So it's just you'll have more room rental fees for sure. And then you'll have additional fees because you're going to have more presenters, which means more LCD packages, more AV packages, all of that sort of stuff. So that's something to really be thoughtful about. And I'll say more about that when we get into setting up the physical space. If you are going to have a plenary space or any sort of meeting that has a stage, you want to make sure you also have an ADA compliant ramp. So this, just the renting of the stage costs $300. There shouldn't be an additional cost for an ADA compliant ramp, but some venues may charge you for that. That's something to negotiate with them at the time of contracting, because it really shouldn't be an additional charge. Any stage should have a ramp up to it, and it should be ADA compliant. But there is additional things to consider here. So if you have a stage and a ramp, an ADA compliant ramp is going to slope up 1 inch for every foot. So it's going to be, it can't be like this, right? That's not accessible. It has to come up very like this. This is more accessible. So it's going to be, depending on how high your stage is, your ramp is going to extend out further into your plenary space, which is going to take up more space, which means you may have to get a larger room. Sort of the same issues that we talked about earlier. So this is something to keep in mind. If you're going to have a stage in a space, you want a ramp, and that ramp is going to take up room, and you need to plan around that. Transportation. This really depends on the location. So I can't give you any cost, but I can give you some considerations. If you have, for instance, chosen a venue that has transportation, like one of the, I can't remember. It's been 2 years since I've traveled, and I've forgotten what it means to travel anymore. But oh yeah, a shuttle, like a hotel shuttle that takes people to key locations in the city. If that's not accessible to people with disabilities, then you have to either negotiate with the venue to provide alternative accessible transportation on their dime, or you have to build it into your own budget to make sure that that's available to everyone. And then if you have a request for like a reader or a note taker, generally, if you have staff with that skill set, I mean, we're talking about someone who's able to take really good notes and who can do it in a way that is accessible to the person requesting it. So it's not always that you have staff with that skill set, but it could just be a matter of bringing staff on to do that. If you do have staff with that skill set, you could also end up having to hire someone to do that. Or as I mentioned, go the C-print route if somebody is asking for this as an accommodation around an intellectual disability. and not a learning disability. So sometimes people need like a note taker because of a learning disability, which then you don't have to sort of translate it into simpler language. You're just taking really good notes. And then if you are going to have an event where there's a high number of folks in the audience who are deaf, and there's going to be a lot of content in ASL, you want to make sure, and the background is busy or really light, you want to budget to have the background draped in a contrasting color for the interpreters, because you can really create a lot of eye strain for deaf people if they're having to both follow the interpreter and there's like swirly patterns in the background, or any sort of glare in the background. So making notes as you're looking at your venue about the background to determine whether or not you need to budget for draping, which can be about $300 a day. So for written materials, some of the common access lines are Braille. And this really, I can't give you a number on this because it depends on the Braille house, and it depends on the amount of printed materials. It's just a great opportunity for you and your organization to identify a possible Braille house that you would work with and get a sense of like how much they charge per page. Is there a difference if they're printing on the front and back of the sheet, and is binding any different? And then you can start to estimate how much it will cost to put materials in Braille, depending on the Braille house that you're using. And then, of course, I mentioned that there could be increased costs to accommodate increased numbers of pages with larger fonts. We've gotten font requests up to 20-point font. And that's just because some people who with low vision require larger font. That takes staff time to convert it into a larger font. And then, of course, there's a number of pages that you then have to print that can increase your costs. I'm going to talk to you about writing in plain language, which is a skill that we can all build. But there's also simple language translation, and this is very different than plain language. So I like to say that because I'm going to teach y'all a little bit about plain language, but simple language takes a higher level of skill set. And so generally you need to consult that out. If somebody has requested something in simple language, you need to find a consultant. Some of the people that we have worked with is like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. They're great about putting stuff into easy read language. Green Mountain Self-Advocates has this skill set. There's not a whole lot of folks in the country with this skill set because ableism has done its job and people with intellectual disabilities haven't been accounted for as people who are going to need to access really vital information. But there are some people who have really built out this skill set and they're great at it, but it does cost money to make that happen. And then sometimes people may request audio tapes, which just basically cost about $75 per hour to put this into an audio tape of the materials, audio of the materials. And then translation of the materials. If you're writing something in English and people need it in Spanish, you need to account for that. Again, that's about $75 per hour to do the translation. And then putting stuff on USBs, once again, that's staff time. So before we get into setting the space, any questions about or comments about budgeting for access? Did this make you nervous about the potential of how much it would cost to make things accessible? Okay, so now we're going to talk about the physical space. Remember, I talked about these different environments that we all have to navigate. And the physical space is an important one. Not only does it have implications for people with physical disabilities, it has implications for people with sensory disabilities. It has implications for people who are blind. It has implications for people with intellectual disabilities. Our physical environment can really either create a very welcoming space, or it can just create a huge message to say, figure it out on your own. We don't really care. And more often than not, our built world, our built environment has not historically cared about people with disabilities. And this is why you see, stairways going up to so many courthouses. You see stairways going up to some of the more historic parts of our country. I find, it's not just people with disabilities around those staircases. It tells us just how much we have not thought about people with disabilities generally. If we're going to build staircases up to courthouses, something that we should all sort of have access to justice. And yet it's just a vast majority of the courthouses in our nation have all of these stairs leading up to them. So we can do our own small part by setting up our physical spaces to be more accessible. I'm going to give you a few tips on how to do that. So for virtual spaces, I mentioned that your platform should meet 508 compliance. You can begin to assess that by searching their website, asking their salesperson. It's a pretty good sign if their salesperson doesn't know what you mean by 508 compliant, that they haven't thought a lot about accessibility. But I mentioned that you could also test the platform with WebAIM, and you can ask people with disabilities for their feedback. Again, the platform's website should display their voluntary product accessibility template, which is a pretty good indicator of their attention to accessibility. You want to make sure that live captioning is integrated into the platform. In other words, you're not having to use one platform to access the content and then something else to access live captioning. And the reason for that is that someone who is both deaf blind or deaf and low vision will need to increase both the captioning and the content, right, at the same time. And at some point, they have to choose one or the other in order to get access to any of it. With integrated live captioning, all they're having to do is magnify the actual one platform. Therefore, they have access to everything right there. Again, you want to make sure they're accessible to a screen reader and that users have the ability to customize their view. Again, people may need their content displayed in larger font. So if they can customize their view, it gives them the ability to make sure that their needs are being met. And again, I would not underestimate the importance of ease of use. It's a virtual space, but there's a lot of you have to do physical things in order to be able to access virtual spaces. And so the easier it is to use, the easier it will be for everyone to participate in your event. So let's talk about physical meeting spaces. There's just a number of different considerations. The meeting room setup is one of them. I mentioned this already, but you really want to create 36-inch aisleways between all barriers. You really want to make sure that you have that you're thinking about the interpreters in line of sight. So if you have interpreters at the front of the room, And you have table stanchions on your table to indicate like a community. Is that going to block people from being able to see the interpreters? If that's the case, you got to think about different way of indicating, like of using those table stanchions. You want to think about like, is the LCD cart in a spot of the room that is going to, and aimed at the screens in a way that will allow deaf participants to be able to watch the interpreters and see the screen, or are they going to have to make a choice there? So it's really being very, very thoughtful about creating line of sight for the deaf participants and the interpreters, but other elements of your meeting as well. You want to make sure that you're creating equal access to seating. One of the practices that I still see in place at many of the, or I did still see in place before we stopped traveling at many of the conferences, is that there's designated seating for deaf and hard of hearing folks, and there's designated seating for people with disabilities. And that is not equal access to seating. Like, that's not something that we're doing to any other participants in that space. We're not saying, Jody, you have to sit right over there, and Sandra, you get to sit over here. Nope, Jody and I are able to sit anywhere we want in these meetings, and yet people with disabilities and deaf people are forced into very specific spots. So this is why we say 36-inch aisleways between all barriers. And our recommended practices around interpreters is if you have a really big event, we recommend that you actually pair deaf people with their own set of interpreters and have the interpreters follow them around. Yes, it costs more, but it creates more equity and access. And so for us, that is the most important thing. Food and beverage, you want to set all items so that they are flush to the edge of the table. And food and beverage, just going back a little bit, I know that we don't always provide food and beverages at our events, but it is really important. Culturally, it's an important thing to be able to provide food and beverage at an event. And it could be really important for some people with disabilities to have access to food and beverage throughout the event, depending on whether they're taking medication that requires them to take it with food, et cetera. So I talk about food and beverage because it is such an important component of in-person meetings. But so often we set up our food and beverage stations so that people with disabilities are not able to access them, particularly people with physical disabilities are not able to access them without asking for help. So, if you think about the last time you went to a meeting where there was food and beverage out, and just think about the risers that the venue might have put up to put, like, you've got one stack of muffins right here, and then a stack of other pastries on the second riser, and then down at the bottom is all the stuff that people don't really want. Those risers create access issues. Like, it's just all of a sudden everyone else is able to, and it's kind of gross now if we think about it, we're like reaching over stuff. So you want to make sure that all items are flushed to the table. So nothing is on a riser, everything's on a platter that's laying on top of the table. And then all items are flushed to the edge of the table. So you're not putting a bunch of stuff in the center of the table where people have to reach over to it. You want to make it really accessible on a nice low table that everybody can reach. And if you're serving coffee, you want to stack them no more than 2 cups high. A lot of times I get to places and they've got these like coffee cup towers that they're using for aesthetic reasons. And it's unnecessary other than to save space. When you can just replenish the coffee cups, which is what I'll talk to venues about. It's just have them on right nearby, and we can just replenish them as they're being used up. The other thing to think about in the physical space is that if you've got people who are traveling with personal care attendants, those personal care attendants are that's one more person in the space. So you need to account for these bodies in the space. So if you have a 30-person meeting, 5 of those people are traveling with personal care attendants, you now have a 35-person meeting. And so that just has implications for the accessibility of your space. And then with bathrooms, you really want to make sure that your accessible restrooms are on the same floor as your main meeting space as much as possible, and that they are functioning. I know you would think that would be a given, but a lot of times the accessible restrooms are not given as high a priority to be fixed. And so you definitely want to go in and make sure that they're accessible. I mean, that they're functional. And then finally, you want to make sure they're accessible. Again, seems like a given, right? But it's not. Accessible restrooms need to have toilets that are 17 to 19 inches high, because that's the standard height of a standard wheelchair. And when you transfer over from your wheelchair to the toilet, you want to have as smooth a transfer as possible. Otherwise, you'll drop down, because most standard toilets are about 14 inches. So a 3-inch drop could really result in injury is very, very hard to recover from. So you want to have a 17 to 19 inches, so you have that really smooth transfer. And yet, many times an accessible toilet will break in the accessible stall or in the accessible restroom, and the property will replace it with a standard toilet. So you have to go in, you have to measure. And when you're measuring those toilets, just FYI, you're measuring from the floor to the top of the lip. You're not with the seat lifted, but with the seat down, so that you're looking for that 17 to 19 inches. You also want to make sure that the accessible restrooms have enough, that the doors open easily. They don't have to have automatic door openers, but they have to be able to be opened with less than 5 pounds of pressure. So you just want to go and test the doors to see how easily they are to open. And then you also want to make sure that there's turning radius in the entry point of the restroom. And that's just usually around 36 inches. This is your key word measurement here. You want to look all of the metal drain pipes are covered. They can be covered in PVC piping, or they could be covered through some sort of fancy architecture where you have like a sloped wooden cover over all of the drains. I'm seeing that more and more in spaces. And the reason for that is that as hot water runs through those steel pipes, those steel pipes get really hot. And if you are a person with a physical disability and you're not registering that you're pressed up against that hot pipe, you could roll away with third-degree burns. So it's a very easy fix that can, if not fixed, can have very severe consequences. So you really want to just peek under those sinks to make sure that those pipes are covered. And then finally, signage and wayfinding. I like to tell people that I was born without an internal compass. Like, you drop me in the middle of New York City and tell me to go east, and I'm going to start crying because I do not know East. I need signage, I need wayfinding, I need things that I like, oh, look for the Walgreens on the right, and then you're, oh, I'm sorry, Dwayne Reed on the right, and then you're gonna know that you're in the right place. This is very true when people show up at meetings. Now keep in mind, and so I've traveled with a colleague who used an electric wheelchair. And, you know, she and I met in a city. We were going to be doing a training. And we were told, you know, go to this location because that's the accessible entry. And so we get there. We get to that location and there's this old-fashioned like lift. Instead of like an elevator, it's like a wheelchair lift that they have to get us to the second space. Get in and we press the button, it's not working. So we get out, we kind of look around, there's no one to help us. And then finally call up to the second floor that we can see and say, hey, is there another way to access this? And the person was just like, well, you have to go around the building. And then they told us, you know, take a left and then, you know, go through down a long sidewalk. And then there's going to be some double doors. You go through those double doors. We did that. We left that space. We went to the corner, took a left, took another left. We look over and there's nothing but double doors. So we're both just like, we don't know. And just finally, we go through several sets of double doors and we finally see the place that we're looking for. And we get in there and there's just really like, it's one of those buildings where you have to sort of know how to interpret hieroglyphics in order to figure out which floor to go to. So we finally figure that out and we finally get to the space that we want to get to. And we're supposed to be presenting and we're like frazzled at this point. So I always think about that experience because it's like, if there had just been some signage and wayfinding all along the way, we could have gotten there and had like just a really easy sort of experience. But instead we walked away from that experience feeling very like annoyed and frustrated with the entire experience. And I bet we didn't present very well either because we were frazzled. We were really frazzled. That's what I think about for our participants. You know, if our participants, we want them to come and learn about human trafficking, something that is a complex topic there's just a lot to be able to, you have to have your full brain to be able to access all of this information, but we're sending them through a labyrinth without any signage and wayfinding. By the time they get to our spaces, they are going to feel frazzled and they're not going to be able to bring in the information that they need. This is going to be true for people with disabilities. It's going to be true for survivors. It's going to be true for anybody with a history of trauma. It's going to be true for people like me with no internal compass. So it's just putting a sign in your front lobby to say you've arrived, you're at the right place, and then having directional signage pointing people to the meeting spaces, whether it's the main registration table, and then other like really clear visible signage to indicate your breakout session. This all creates just more headspace for people to be able to take in your really vital information. That is my sermon on signage. I'm going to pause for the interpreter switch. Okay, so we have about 50 minutes left together. I'm wondering if we should give folks like just a 5-minute break. This is a long time to sit together and stare at the screen. So if Jody, sorry, any thoughts on this? Folks and the participants, you want to type into the chat if you'd appreciate a 5-minute break at this point? Okay, let's take 5 minutes and come back together at 4:15. This is Sandra. I'm just going to give the 1 minute warning. Our break will be up in 1 minute. Okay, this is Sandra. Let's get back to it. We're now going to move to talking about accessible materials. So accessible materials impact your attitudinal environment and certainly your communication environment. We communicate a tremendous amount of information through our materials. We have, for events, there might be workshop descriptions, there might be bios of the faculty. There could be information, just like extra information that we're putting into our program materials that lead people to want to learn more about what you do as an organization. There could be resource materials there to help people who might need help to get out of a trafficking situation. So it's just we communicate a lot of information through our materials. So it's really important that they are accessible. And there are two elements of accessible materials. It's like how you choose to convey the information through your writing, and then the design and format of the material. So I'm going to start with the first, how you choose to actually write the material out and convey the information. I know that many of you have academic backgrounds. I certainly do as well. And all through my academic background, I got lots of accolades for using really fancy words. The fancier, the better. If I could say something in 20 words versus 5, that was better. And so we have all been trained to use more complex language. And yet we are also in the world, in the fields of working with people who need information given to them in the plainest possible way. Not just talking about people with disabilities. Any survivor who is processing their trauma, processing, and that doesn't happen in a day, right? That processing and the brain fog that comes about when you are processing that information, that happens over a long period of time. And so you can expect that if you're a service provider or if you're training service providers, that they are going to need to be able to communicate in plain language. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what plain, let me back up a little bit, about what plain language is. So it came from the health literacy world, where doctors and nurses had this moment of like, oh, our patients kind of need to understand what it is that we're telling them about their diagnosis. And so there was a real movement to start like really being able to communicate information, again, in the plainest possible way. So instead of using really complicated words, you use plainer words. Instead of throwing all the information that you think a person needs to know at them, you decide what do they need to know right now and when can they get additional information later. So you have to make choices when you're writing in plain language. And I'm just going to do a real quick primer on this because it's something that you have to really practice, and I'm still working on it. I have a hard time speaking in plain language. Writing in plain language is easier for me because I can be more thoughtful about how I'm constructing my sentences. But this is a skill that you have to practice because we've been taught to write in far more complex ways. And now we're having to unlearn that a little bit in order to write in plain language. So there's just some basic tips here. First is just use common words as much as possible. If you must use an unfamiliar word, define them for the reader. For instance, my third bullet point here, I have avoid or explain acronyms, jargon, and idioms. And not everybody knows what an idiom is, that an idiom is an expression that draws on cultural context and therefore is hard to interpret across culture, because what does it mean to hit that one out of the park? We know as Americans that it means you've done a really good job, but people who are not followers of baseball, I almost said football, would not really pick that up. So it's important to avoid those idioms, but it's also important to explain what an idiom is, because not everybody knows that word. You also want to really avoid confusing words and phrases. It's just like avoiding turns of phrases and constructing sentences in ways that that causes confusion. I can give you an example here. It's sort of what I just did. When we speak, a lot of what is coming out of our heads at that time, or our mouths at that time, are unedited, unfiltered thoughts. And so they might meander all over the place. When we write that way, it can become very confusing. So I don't know how many of you follow or have read James Joyce. His stream of consciousness writing won him a lot of accolades through the years, and he's a famous writer, but it's really hard to follow his writing. And imagine if you were trying to support a survivor in the moment using stream of consciousness. So you really just want to make sure, and I'm going to walk you through some quick strategies for doing this, that you are writing short sentences, that you're splitting and disconnecting sentences, and that you're avoiding really like confusing sort of stream of consciousness, or confusing construction of sentences that really could make one person read it one way and another person read it another way. And again, you want to avoid or explain acronyms, jargon, and idioms. And if you have to use an acronym, just because sometimes it's a lot easier to say, I have a funder called the Office on Violence Against Women, but we talk about the Office on Violence Against Women as OVW. So it's nice to be able to say, our funder is the Office on Violence Against Women, OVW in parentheses, and then to use OVW throughout. So as long as you've explained it at some point, it's okay to use the acronym, but try to avoid it, doing it as just sort of the first time that you've introduced this concept. Okay. I'm gonna make y'all work with me here. I know y'all have been sitting and just listening to me, but we're got a little exercise here. So we're gonna practice unlearning what we've learned about how it's better to use more words than just one. So our first set of words is, it is often the case that. How might we write that in plain language? And you can type it into the chat. How would you make, it is often the case that plain, what's a plainer way to say that? Yeah, often. Thanks, Jody. Whoops. As a consequence of, because. What about during the time that? While, right? Yeah, or during. Thanks, Laura. It could be during, it could be while, but you don't have to use more than one word in most of these cases. Here's one that I see a lot in policies and procedures that I review: in close proximity. What's an easier, plainer way of saying that? In close, there you go, Jody. How about utilize? I'm taxing y'all here. I'll give you the answer, use. And then what about subsequent? Another one that we see a lot in policies, procedures, manuals. After. So you can see that while we have way more complicated words here and phrases here on the left, you can usually put things into one word if you try. You also want to be specific and comprehensive when you're speaking in plain language and not assume people's knowledge or what they or that they know what you do or what to do in any particular situation. And plain language speaks directly to the reader using you and your. So here's an example. We believe that to accomplish our goals, we must provide forums for those we serve to give feedback. We offer written surveys and encourage open discussion and positive conflict resolution. However, there may be times when differences cannot be resolved through such methods. This document explains the procedure that can be used to address those differences. Here we can see that a lot of what the writer is trying to convey is not getting conveyed. It's all jumbled up and a lot of unnecessary words, and we don't know who they're talking to. So now when we start to speak directly to the reader, it reads, we believe that to accomplish our goals, we must provide you opportunities for feedback. We offer you written surveys and encourage open discussion and positive conflict resolution. However, there may be times when our differences cannot be resolved through these methods. This document explains a procedure you can use to address those differences. Just by changing it up so that you're using you and your, it becomes clearer what they are talking about. Other tips for plain language, you want to write sentences with no more than 15 words. So if you have a sentence that is running over 15 words, you're probably not writing in plain language. And you might want to use a strategy called split and disconnect, which I'll talk about in just a second. Convey one idea per sentence. I think this is the tip that I use the most when I am trying to put stuff into plain language, is to figure out, am I trying to convey too much in this particular sentence? And can I break down the one idea here and pick up the next idea in another sentence? Again, using active voice and really like directing your speaking to the person, you and your. And then as much as possible, avoid if-then sentences. Doesn't mean you have to avoid if-then scenarios, but the recommendation is that those sort of if-then situations should be conveyed through a table so that you have the visual support of if on one column, then in the other column. It's just helps visually to support that sort of the kind of situation where you're setting up an if-then scenario. Mentioned this a little bit earlier, but you want to clearly distinguish need to know information from nice to know information and organize the information to serve the reader's needs. So you don't need to throw everything but the kitchen sink at somebody. You have to figure out what they need to know at that time and provide that to them. I know that when I used to work at a battered women's shelter, our intake packet was just a ridiculous number of pages. And we the advocates were always just like, why do we have to ask all of this right now? Like, why is this necessary to collect now versus further down into the services? So again, need to know, nice to know, and then organizing the information to serve the reader's need. I'm going to skip past. Oh, okay. Here's my split and disconnect. So in the first sentence, we've got one sentence and someone who's not me can be counting the words in this sentence. I'm sure there are more than 15 here, but the sentence reads, while the program values the confidentiality of your information, should it become necessary to make a mandatory report of abuse, you disclose to us to the authorities. There's one of those confusing turns of phrases, by the way. Pausing. Thank you. Should you, let me start over. While the program values the confidentiality of your information, should it become necessary to make a mandatory report of abuse you disclose to us to the authorities, the program will notify you and invite you to be part of the process, but will proceed without your permission. Now, this is a policy telling somebody that they may need to violate their confidentiality because of a higher authority that makes the program responsible for reporting abuse. That's a pretty important nugget of information that somebody needs to get. So to make this a little bit more digestible, putting it into distinct sentences. So right now we have one sentence, but in this when we split and disconnect, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different sentences because we are trying to convey 5 distinct ideas or thoughts in this communication. So you want to split each particular sentence, disconnect it, create like a bridger, like a however or a but, and then keep moving through to show how these ideas are connected, but don't try to jam it all into one sentence. I mentioned passive voice versus active voice. Wanted to move into sort of how we actually use design to make things more accessible. And it really does start with using headers to identify new sections and topics. Sometimes it's really helpful to call out really important information in short bulleted lists. And it's always helpful to try to include graphics to explain key ideas or actions. Now let's talk about design elements. One of the most critical elements of design when you are designing your print materials or electronic materials has to do with your typeface. This is like the fonts that we use. And I think we have been trained into using Times New Roman or other fonts in the serif family, but the most accessible fonts are the sans serif fonts. These are fonts like Arial or Helvetica or Verdana. And the reason is that they are planar. They don't have like decorative little ends at the end of the S. I'll show you in just a second. They're just in, these are nice clean edges and they don't run together for somebody who has low vision. They don't create any sort of visual distractions for somebody who has intellectual or cognitive disabilities. And so they're just cleaner, plainer, crisper on the page. So these are the recommended fonts. These are the ones that you want to avoid. You see these serifs at the end, they start to really create those distractions that I mentioned. They can run together and make it look like, it's the smaller the font, the worse this gets, make it look like just a block of black versus what we saw with the sans serif font, which was a lot cleaner and you could see the black against the white. So you want to Always, always. If you have the option, choose a sans serif font. I know in some places, like in our grant applications, we're required to use Times New Roman 12-point font. We don't have any choice, but when you have a choice, opt for a sans serif font. You also want to use upper and lowercase letters, particularly for your body material, like your body text. And that's because people with cognitive and intellectual disabilities, dyslexia, learning disabilities, they use the rise and fall of these letters, and people who are low vision, to better be able to access the information. And so when you use everything's in uppercase, we don't have that same rise and fall of letters. And so it's harder to access the information that you're trying to share. Uppercase headings are fine because usually it's one distinct idea in that header. And so that's fine, but you want to avoid that for body content. And of course, you also want to avoid extra thin, extra black, italicized fonts. I know they're pretty sometimes, but they do tend to create barriers for accessing written information. And I don't even know why anybody would want to use these two fonts, because they're hard for pretty much anyone to read, much less somebody with low vision or who gets distracted by those sorts of decorative fonts that we see here. Font size, I mentioned earlier, the more universally accessible font size is 14-point. 12-point is, as I mentioned, what we have become accustomed to using. And from time to time, folks will put things in 10-point font because they're trying to shove a lot of information on a page. But 14-point font, from the disability community, that's who has told us that that is a much more universally accessible font. Not to say it's universally accessible, because some people need fonts in larger point, but if you start with 14-point, you're going to have to make far fewer accessibility changes. I wanted to give you an example of like what it looks like when you do have to go from 14-point to larger points, such as an 18-point font. Basically what it does is it changes up the amount of information that can go on the page, and you may have to like make sure that the words are not breaking up in weird places, sentences aren't breaking up, or paragraphs aren't breaking up in weird places. So you just have to pay attention to the format there when you put stuff into large font. Again, you're looking for line length of 8 to 15 words. Now, remember, 15 words is the maximum you want for plain language, but also for a line of information on a page should be between 8 to 15 words. You always want to justify on the left margin. And this is because when you do like a full justification, it actually creates what is called a river effect between the words, where you see like large gaps between the words on the page that are very distracting for the regular reader, and incredibly is a huge barrier for someone with cognitive disability or a learning disability like dyslexia. So we want to avoid full margin. And you want to justify on the left margin, because that's when people are learning to read and navigate their disability at the same time. They, just like they are using the rise and fall of the upper and lowercase letters, they're also looking for that page break at the end, or that line break at the end of a sentence, and then coming back over here to sort of follow the sentence along. So they need that jagged edge on the right-hand side, so that they know that they're following. And obviously, you would never want to center your body text. And we would just say avoid the right, justifying on the right margin, because people are learning this whole thing with everything justified on the left. And of course, you want to avoid awkward hyphenation at all times. But definitely when you're really breaking up the word in a way that is going to make it very difficult for people to fully understand. So like people with disabilities experience domestic and sexual, like these just don't make sense. So if you have to break up a word like that, it's better to just take the word to the next line. And this is just some examples. Once again, here's that river effect that I talked about. You see how when it's fully justified, there are these big gaps in that paragraph, and that creates that river effect that I was mentioning earlier. And here's where you can see sort of the jagged edge of the right-hand side, much, much easier to follow. Another really critical element of accessible design is making sure you have enough color contrast, enough contrast. So the most accessible would be black on white, right? The color, you can do a darker gray on a white background, but you want to avoid like a lighter gray on a white background because it's not accessible. You can use reverse text to help call out information, but again, you want to make sure that the text in the background, it has a lot of contrast between, like, so here we have a white text on a black background, which is accessible. And then you can do like a blue to a yellow background, but you want to avoid on the color wheel any colors that are adjacent to one another. You really want to go with the colors that are across from each other on the color wheel. Sorry, I missed a slide title here. So this should say color contrast 2. But you want to avoid using photos behind text. You see on the right-hand side, you've got the text over the little girl. Not only does that sort of send a message that she's not quite as important as you might think she would be if you're having partnerships in health, and she's the featured image, but now you've covered her entire face with text, but it also just makes it hard to read the text itself. So it's great to use photos, but make sure you're not putting the text over the photo. But it is really great to try to support your content with images. For those of you unfamiliar with the domestic violence world, there is a tool that is used in the domestic violence world called the power and control wheel. And it is made up of just what you see here, except in each of these little spokes of the wheel, there's tons of words. And we had a community that we worked with who actually worked with a graphic illustrator and a group of people with intellectual disabilities to actually create sort of a bit pictorial power and control wheel that has far fewer words and images that support the contents of what it is saying. And this is an example of simple language. This is the sort of language where I said you would have to hire out for, because you see you're using far fewer words and you have images that really support the text. So most people would be able to get a sense from the image of what is maybe happening there. That there's bullying, threatening the animal, using force and threats, so you see that even without, you don't necessarily need the words to know what's going on. Okay, so we're at 4:43. We have a number of resources on our website, which is endabusepeoplewithdisabilities.org. It's endabusepwd.org. We have online courses, we have tip sheets, and we have lots and lots of recordings and live events so that you can learn more about this. But now I'm going to open it up to see if there are any questions. I'm gonna stop sharing. Nope.
This is Sara. First of all, thank you so much, Sandra, for this wonderful presentation. And while we wait for questions to come in, I shared our email address in the chat. So if anybody has any questions about the presentation or about the working group in general, please feel free to email us. I'm also sharing a link to a short survey about this presentation that I hope all of you will fill out. And I'm also sending out an email about that in case somebody is not able to get the link from the chat. A quick reminder for those who are receiving CEUs from this event, filling out the evaluation will be required for you to receive your CEUs. So please remember to do that.
Well, thanks everyone who stuck it out with us. I know this was long. There's a lot of information to share. And I appreciate those of you. Thank you to T-Batemon in the chat, who is saying that you're going to incorporate it into future. That makes me so excited. Would love, that's really, okay, Aiken from South Carolina is going to be incorporating this information into future presentations. That makes me really excited. We, with the National Human Trafficking People with Disabilities Working Group, are here for you. So if you have questions, comments, any other follow-up, feel free to reach out to us. Sorry, put the email address in the link. And yeah, please do your best to make your events, your materials as accessible as possible, and let us know if you have any questions. Thanks everyone, and have a great rest of your week. Take care.